Hello and welcome students to the library. My name is Lindsay McCowan and today we will be talking about copyright laws. The standard that I considered for today was ITSE Standard 2C. Students demonstrate an understanding of and respect for the rights and obligations of using and sharing intellectual property. And I use that standard to form our lesson objective for today. Students will be able to demonstrate understanding of copyright laws when given real-life situations to evaluate accurately all the time. Now, this is something that is coming up in your class, so we are really going to go over what does copyright mean? I know this is probably the question in your brain right now. Copyright? Am I writing something? Am I copying it down? Well, let's take a look at the definition. So Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines copyright as the exclusive legal right to reproduce, publish, sell, or distribute the matter and form of something, such as literary, musical, or artistic work. Now, what does that actually mean? So, in other words, you cannot use other people's work without permission. If you do, that is considered stealing. So, let's look at the definition again. The exclusive legal right. So that means legally the people who have produced and published something such as a book or music or a painting are legally protected by their work because they are the ones who have created it. And if you wish to use it in some form, you have to gain permission. Now, sometimes that actually means getting written permission to use something, but also there's times where that means you have to buy something in order to obtain that work and use it properly. A really easy example to think of is that you buy a DVD of a movie that someone has produced. That is legally obtaining the work because it is copyrighted instead of you downloading it illegally. So there's a big difference there. So copyright legally protects people who create new things. Now, what does copyright include? This is a big one. So what it includes, copyright protection is extended to items such as songs, images, software, and literature. So these are all things that can be connected back to an author or producer. So Taylor Swift writes her songs. It is protected under copyright because she is the author of that song. The same goes for images that are created by a photographer or a painter, software that's created by a coder, or an author writing a piece of literature. What copyright does not protect are intangibles, such as ideas, methods of operations, or systems. So these are things that cannot necessarily be tied back to one person producing. A lot of times these are very common sense, public knowledge types of things that not one person can really be attributed for because it's just generally the best practice of things. Now, why should I respect copyright? It seems like it could be really easy now with the internet just to find something online and use it. It's on the internet, isn't it? Well, let's put this into perspective. I want you to think about if you invented a really cool game and everybody loved it. It was amazing. And suddenly you find out that someone stole that from you and they gave you no credit. And even now they're starting to make money off of it, but you don't get any money. How would you feel? Probably terrible and probably really upset. And that's the same thing you're doing if you're taking someone else's work without following the rules. There still needs to be proper credit and permission when using other people's work. Also, it's the law. So the Copyright Law of 1976 protects against copyright infringement, which means using copyrighted materials illegally. And those fines can range from $750 to $250,000 and up to 5 years in prison. Now, I don't know about you, but I do not have the time or the money to deal with that. So it is very important, as you can tell, to use copyrighted materials correctly. I'm sure none of you want to experience actually being tangled up in copyright infringement. And there are people who have had this issue. Some really famous copyright cases, Star Wars versus Battlestar Galactica, Apple versus Microsoft, the vacuum companies James Dyson versus Hoover, Gucci versus Guess. All of these cases were about copyright, and I can almost assure you that they all cost a lot of money because someone did not follow copyright law correctly. Now let's look at the rules. This is probably where you're like, okay, I understand what it means, but now what do I actually do with that? So what's important to remember is that materials protected by copyright should not be used without permission of the owner. So this also includes published and unpublished work. So if the author is in the middle of writing a story, you cannot take that work because it is still protected under copyright for that author. But however, there are a few exceptions in using copyright materials. So consider these kind of the keys for using copyright in your own life. The first is fair use. And as students, you actually have a lot of allowance to use items. They just have to be very purposeful in how you're using them. So fair use allows for the use of copyright protected materials for specific purposes such as education. However, to qualify under fair use, the usage of the material must qualify under these 4 factors. So remember, it's called fair use. So you can't just say, oh, I'm going to use all of this book because it's for school. That's not fair. That's not fair. To use fair use properly, you have to consider these 4 factors. So first, you have to consider the purpose and character of the use, including whether the use is of a commercial nature or is for non-profit educational purposes. So you should not be making a profit off of this. It should be purely educational. Second, the nature of the copyrighted work, such as whether the work is fiction or nonfiction, published or unpublished. These are all things you just have to think about before you use. Number 3, the amount of work used in relation to the copyrighted work as a whole. So you would need to consider, is it really fair for me to use a 600-page book for a lesson if I scanned every single page? Not very fair. However, it could be considered fair as an educational purpose if I needed to scan 1 chapter from that very long book. If it's for educational purposes, of course. So that's one of those things that you have to consider, what is actually truly fair in this situation. And then finally, you have to consider the effect of the use upon the potential market for the copyrighted work. So all of these things to consider for fair use. And with education and with you being students, there is a lot that you can do with this. You just have to remember to be fair in how you use it. Now, public domain is amazing because these are ideas and materials under public domain. So that means that there's no restrictions for public usage because there is no designation of it being intellectual property. So that means anyone can use it. There are people who specifically publish things into the public domain so that anybody and everybody can use it. Now, what's interesting about public domain is that items that used to be protected under copyright can become public domain after a certain amount of time. So copyright expires after the life of the author plus 70 years. So to put this into perspective, let's say that a person published a book and they lived their life all the way until 2020. Now, copyright was protected through the extent of their whole life until it ended in 2020. And now the copyright will also still be protected until 2090, 70 years after the author has passed. But after that time, it is now considered public domain. Anybody can use it for their purposes, and that's why we can use things like Shakespeare in a lot of our in our music. We use Shakespeare a lot in music and movies and things, and that's because it's now public domain. Enough time has passed that we can kind of use some of these ideas again. Now, here's really where we come down to it. What does this mean for me as a student? You've learned about what copyright is, why you should respect it, how should I use it? But for you as a student now, copyright is important for you to understand, follow, and respect as a student because it is an ethical practice for any scholar. And yes, you are an 8th grade scholar right now, and it's a skill that's going to take a while to master. So learning now can help you from making a serious mistake in the future. And we've seen earlier just how expensive that mistake could cost you. I've put together a couple of resources here, images and songs that are public domain that you can go to and use without any worry. Some more information here about copyright, that in case you have any questions. And then here is also the copy of the rubric that your teacher will be grading you on your understanding of copyright. So, I hope you've learned, and let me know if you have any questions.